So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Strength in Numbers session, meeting privacy compliance during COVID-19. My name is Kerrilee Auger. I'm the Skills Development Manager here at Women's Enterprise Center, and I look after all of our training, workshops, webinars, and forums such as this, based out of our Kelowna office. And if there's a topic that you would like to suggest or recommend for us for any of our sessions, please be sure to watch out for the follow-up email and provide your thoughts and ideas along with recommended speakers as well. So today during this session, I think most of us are familiar with Zoom now in this day and age. A lot of us have been doing a lot of things on Zoom, but just in case, we're going to be using the Q&A and chat features. So you should see those at the bottom of your screen or perhaps in the top, depending on how you're set up. So please go ahead, and as we're going through and covering some of this content, please, throw your questions in there as they come up, and we'll be sure to review those and try to address them all for you here today as well. And on today's session, I'm really thrilled to have our panelist, Marilyn Sing, joining us. And she is a certified information privacy professional in Canada, so CIPP/C. She's a principal consultant at IPP Consulting, which was launched in 2016. And this Victoria-based company focuses on helping organizations meet their obligation to operate in compliance with BC and other applicable privacy laws. As a consultant, Marilyn assesses the client's current situation and then provides advice and guidance to prevent information breaches and reduce privacy-related risks. She accomplishes this by protecting personal and sensitive information through sound policy, good business practices, strong safeguards, implementing and maintaining a privacy management program, training staff, and up-to-date information on changes in privacy law. With previous management experience working for private, public, and nonprofit organizations in marketing, communications, business development, risk management, and operations, Marilyn utilizes her business background with her privacy expertise to develop privacy program controls that complement IT security, support business continuity, and meet compliance. And then through ongoing professional development to maintain her CIPP/C certification, and as a member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals, she keeps herself up to date on Canadian and international privacy law. And Marilyn, I get your weekly updates, and I thank you for those because they're also very good information during this time. So we're really thrilled to have you joining us here today. Thank you very much. And everyone help me welcome Marilyn. Thank you. So just briefly, for those of you joining us potentially for the first time, a quick overview of Women's Enterprise Center and the services that we provide to support women entrepreneurs. We help you realize your business potential through business loans of up to $150,000. We offer professional advice and resources through our client service and business advisory teams, skills training such as this session, other online resources as well, through our mentoring programs, and through the supportive community that's built through attending forums like this, joining our other webinars, workshops, and mentoring programs. And we do all of this from our 3 offices located in Kelowna, Victoria, and Vancouver. But we have a team as well as regional ambassadors and entrepreneurs in residence throughout the province, also in some of our rural areas. We are funded by the federal government through Western Economic Diversification, and we're part of the Women's Enterprise Initiative, including similar organizations in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So to learn more about all of these services and other organizations, be sure to visit our website at womensenterprise.ca. And briefly, during these Strength in Numbers sessions, we've been providing and updating as much information as we can on our COVID-19 page, which you see there, wec.ca/COVID-19. And we today, I guess yesterday, learned about a recent revision on the CIBA loan program. So this is, I guess, CIBA version 3. So the revision opens up this emergency funding program, which is the $40,000 loan, to more businesses, including sole proprietorships and those who pay themselves via dividends. People must apply through their main financial institution where they have their business bank account. And then for those that don't qualify for CEBA, you can look at the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund, RRRF, through the Community Futures and Western Diversification at the moment. And then both of these funding programs, as a reminder, are to be used to cover non-deferrable expenses such as rent, insurance, lease payments, and regularly scheduled debt servicing payments. And then for those whose revenues are down 70% or more and who have rent payments, you should also speak with your landlord about applying for the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program, and the landlord must apply to support you in that. Landlords should not be asking you for financial information. The tenant signs an attestation that they meet the requirements, and landlords should also not be charging fees as there are no fees to apply. Under this program, the government pays 50% of the rent to the landlord and the tenant pays 25%. So just quickly, I'm going to pop up onto the screen our COVID-19 resource page for you to take a look at. So this is where we do provide most of those updates on a weekly basis for you. So you can see here the different resources and support sessions that we have coming up, the government updates on programs as well. And then, resources, what additional help do you need? So if there's a topic that you would like us to host, as I mentioned earlier, a session on, you can let us know as well on that page. So that's probably one you want to bookmark for the next little while and check back for updates. Another great way is to sign up for our e-news and e-blasts as well. And then just as we're going through this COVID-19, again, reopening in phase 2, potentially moving into phase 3, what does that mean? Just some quick tips and resources for you. We have recordings of all of these sessions available at wec.ca, Strength in Numbers. And we really want to emphasize for right now, you really should focus on what you can control. So within your own world, within your own business, follow public health authorities. So there are recommendations of Dr. Bonnie Henry. Managing your cash flow, that's really important at this time. We do have a very simple and easy to use cash flow template on our website if you need some assistance there. Practicing your negotiation skills. We're all in a time now we're negotiating with our suppliers, with our employees, with our lenders. So, honing up on those. We have currently right now our financial fitness webinar series and our negotiation workshop are available for free viewing on our website. So I encourage you to take the time to watch those, right? We want to work on our resilience in getting through this because that's going to lead to innovation. So, maybe adapting your business, the way you do things to get through times like these, and then creating those action plans, right? So what are you able to do and what can you control for the next 30, 60, and 90 days? So again, wec.ca/COVID-19 is a great place. And then wec.ca/strength in numbers as well. So again, just a reminder as we jump into our topic today with Marilyn, to please use the chat and the Q&A to submit your questions, and we'll be monitoring those as well. And I want to thank as well Danielle Hofer, who's assisting us as well today in the background, managing the questions and the Q&A. So thank you, Danielle. So great. Now, Marilyn, you're sitting there waiting patiently as I ramble on. Thank you so much. We're ready to jump in. So Danielle, if you want to take over the screen share and grab those slides, that would be great. And Marilyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerrilee, and thank you to everyone who's attending this session today. I'm hoping that you'll find it interesting and useful, and that it'll help you ensure that your businesses do remain compliant with privacy law. So
great. And how does that look? Can you see the screen and it looks good?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Great. So, so the next slide. So in today's session, I'm going to be focusing first on the 2 guidance documents that were released by the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia. Then, since video conferencing has become such a big area of focus since the pandemic started, I'll review some best practices and technology safeguards to ensure that you are using a video conferencing application in compliance with BC's privacy law. And then after that, I'm going to cover compliance and provide you with a high-level overview of private sector privacy law, review the definition of personal information, and then inform you about regulation, risks, and costs related to non-compliance, and what you are required to do to ensure your business is compliant. I'll end with some privacy tips, and there will be some time to answer questions. But I don't mind if you have questions during the presentation, but sometimes I find that people will ask questions that I'll later cover the answer to in the presentation. So if that's the case, I'll let you know that instead of answering the question right away, I'll defer it till later. I also want to let you know that copies of the presentation will be available through the Women's Enterprise Center. And this includes my contact information and a list of sources that I've used for this session, so you can link to it for more detailed information. So getting on with the first of the 2 guidance documents. This one was actually released on May 21st, so it's the most recent one. The privacy commissioners wanted to make sure that establishments understand the requirement to collect personal information for contact tracing purposes. It's also important for us as individuals to understand how this affects us in regards to the protection of our own personal information. So as I said, the purpose of collection is for contact tracing purposes. So in case someone who visited an establishment at the time you were there and was diagnosed with COVID-19, they have the ability to contact you and notify you and let you know. So what this means is that if you are a food and drink establishment, you need to retain contact information for 1 member of every party of patrons, and that you have a requirement to retain that information for a 30-day time period. Also, while you're holding that information, you need to make sure it's protected with safeguards that actually prevent unauthorized access or similar risks. So the next slide. So there are some best practices which require that you are required to follow. So it's important to clearly explain why you're collecting the information and why you need it. It might be best to actually have a copy of the order to show customers. Otherwise, you'll need to train all your staff to make sure that they are able to explain to an individual why you need to collect and hold their information. It's important that it's important that you're only collecting the minimum amount of information needed. So that means a name and a phone number or email and the date of the visit. You have to make sure that you secure this information. You can't leave it in a publicly accessible area, so you should make sure that it's kept in a locked file cabinet, or if it's a list that you're maintaining on a computer, that it's password protected, encrypted, and on a secure network. From the disclosure perspective, it's important that you don't share that information with anyone unless a health officer has requested the information from you. If that information is shared with that health officer, you need to make sure you keep a record of it. It's important to routinely and securely destroy the information after that 30-day time period. So if you can get yourself into a practice of deleting it 31 days after the information has been collected, it might be easier to add and delete on that 30-day time span. It's important that you shred any paper and delete and trash any digital records so that they're not being held any longer. And the reason for this is you want to protect both the individual's private information as well as decrease the risk and liability on your side of keeping that information longer than you need to. Okay, so on to the next guidance document that was released by the Privacy Commissioner. This one was actually released in March, so shortly after the pandemic was announced and everything was shut down. On March 14th, the Privacy Commissioner released this to make sure that care was taken and considered when personal information was leaving the work sites. So these next 4 slides actually cover tips to keep personal information safe when you're working away from the office. This first one, as you can see, covers mobile devices. It's important to make sure devices are password protected and locked when not in use, and ensure that any kind of portable storage devices that you're using are encrypted and password protected. And of course, it's always important to keep your software up to date. And the reason why this is more critical when you're working at home as well is because a lot of the security patches are included in software updates. So the sooner you update software when it's available, the better you protect that information. So the next slide covers emails. So it's important to make sure that you're only using work email accounts for work-related emails involving personal data. And before sending an email, double check to ensure it's being sent to the right, correct recipient, particularly for emails that have personal data or sensitive personal data. And the next tips are in regards to paper copies and files. Of course, you should only remove personal information from the office if it's necessary to carry out your job duties. You should never take more than what you need in order to do the job. As this says, take the least amount and leave the rest behind. So it's important also to securely store any paper files when they're not in use. And this means locking files away and not leaving any files in your vehicle. The next slide covers, I believe, general rules. So avoid using personal information collected and used for work in public. So you should be strictly working on those files only at home. And if you must actually be in a place that's not in a protected area, you need to make sure that no one else can view that information while you're working on it. So there are other things to consider, other risks related to employees using their own devices. So this includes their own cell phones, computers, tablets, printers. You need to make sure that there's not going to be any sort of vulnerabilities. There needs to be passwords on devices. You need to consider whether people are using what's considered to be more vulnerable apps or things that people may be able to hack into and break into, like social media applications. And if other people do have access to the devices that you're using for work purposes, you also need to be quite careful about that. You need to make sure that they're not able to access your work information. So whether that's, again, protected by passwords or or files that are held in sort of a secure area, it's really important to consider those things. And the reason for that is because you don't want to create any risk and liability for that person who's sharing the device with you. You have to consider if there was a breach, for example, that it would not only be you that might be looked at as being the potential vulnerability and risk where it happened, but it could be the other people that have access to your devices as well. So it really protects them from any potential liability. Okay, so that covers the 2 areas where the Privacy Commissioner was quite concerned and released those guidances out to the public so that businesses could take care of those particular areas. And so,
Marilyn, is it okay if I just jump in with a question? Because
sure.
one I had was about the encryption piece, because you spoke about that a couple times.
Okay.
Right, so that 30-day information, in encrypting that data, are there programs or resources available people? Because potentially that might not be standard practice for a restaurant, say, because they're not collecting that customer data. Right. So how can we, what type of things can we look at in yes, you can password protect an Excel file or something like that, but how do we encrypt it? Is there a tool? And the same for the USBs, because I've used a flash drive before and put not personal information, but you throw a PowerPoint or something on it just in case, but I've never thought of encrypting that. So what are some tips around that? Is there software or something available to support people?
Yes, there are encryption software available. I know, and it's terrible. I can't think off the top of my head what they are for PCs. I know that Macs actually do have an encryption security key that you can actually set. So in terms of hardware, there's that ability. Certainly as a follow-up, I can check with my IT experts and come back with some recommendations on encryption for the PC side. So I'm happy to do that. I'll make a note right now.
That would be great, yeah.
And in terms of, you mentioned USBs, you can actually buy USBs that allow you to set a password on them. And so they can't be opened unless you do that. I know on a Mac, you can actually take a regular USB and run it through something within the system that actually will encrypt that USB. So you don't have to specifically buy one that is encryptable. So there's those potential areas.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
and the
great.
best to do is to at least just have a password on a computer if you're using a computer system for that.
Great. And I see here we have from Danita has chimed in the chat and says recommending VeraCrypt across platform, and that Windows, if you're on Windows Pro, has BitLocker. So some suggestions there as well. So that's great. Thank you, Danita, and thank you, Marilyn. Sorry to interrupt for that. We'll jump into the video conferencing piece now, which has also seen a surge in usage these last few months.
Yes, as you can see here, I've actually got 5 logos up on the screen. In case you don't recognize them, the first one is Adobe Connect. Second one is FaceTime. That's of course available for Mac devices, Skype, which everyone's familiar with, Cisco WebEx, and Zoom, of course, which we're using today, and has actually surged to become one of the most popular in use now. I think prior to the pandemic, there was less than, I think around 8 million people, and now I heard it's 30 million plus, and continuing to increase. So I guess I wanted to start off by just talking about some best practices. So it's important to consider first whether it's actually really even necessary to use a video conferencing tool. In most cases, well, not in the case of this, where we're actually sharing screens and doing presentations, but for communicating personal information or sensitive information, it's best to try to avoid video conferencing if you don't need it. So I think the main thing to do is keep in mind that you are still responsible for protecting personal information through whatever application that you choose to use. So again, think about purpose first, and then whether or not it's really necessary to use the video conferencing tool. And then, of course, the really important thing is do your research and make sure you're avoiding products by companies with known privacy problems. And of course, I would highly recommend that you do not use a free application, because they typically, well, mostly lack privacy and security features. And just in terms of taking a look at what that really allows you to do is to make sure that there's passwords involved and that there's administration controls, because you want to be able to control as much as you can in regards to that application that you're using. So in terms of technology safeguards, you want to make sure that there's end-to-end encryption. A lot of times products will promote that they have encryption features, but they're actually not end-to-end. And end-to-end provides that extra, privacy aspect that some products do not have. It's also important to think about recordings. I would recommend that you actually don't record a session if there's personal information involved, unless there is the ability to save that recording in Canada. Again, from a privacy perspective and in compliance with privacy law, that's a pretty critical thing. Now, I know lots of people ask me about Zoom in general, and Kerrilee would have seen from the weekly updates that I send out that Zoom has had lots of problems. It actually has some very well-known privacy problems, and only within the last month have they actually hired some security experts to come in and actually try to address some of those problems. So Zoom is far from perfect right now. I would highly recommend, if you're using Zoom, that you convert to at least that $20 a month paid package. That's not a lot of money, but it's going to add that extra security level that you should be using. And does anybody have any questions? I know sometimes video conferencing kind of will get people's temperature rising and thinking, am I doing the right thing? And what should I be doing?
Yeah, I know one of the things, because we went through that as well, we've been using Zoom for a year, but always on a paid business account. So it does have, a lot of those security features. And for sessions like this, right, really, we're not disclosing any personal information at all. It's more just, sharing of knowledge, which is great. But one thing that I did see was a lot of people were, when they were talking about the Zoom hijacking, where people would come in, was when people were sharing a link on like a Facebook page and things like that, like a very public page where anybody could jump on. So they always recommend, share the event, but perhaps not the link unless you've got a registration page and things like that. So what are your thoughts on that? And I know we're talking here specifically about like if you have customer or client information, but in general, is there a few precautions people can take as well on that sense, using any of these? Microsoft Teams, I think, is another platform I've seen popping up recently as well that people are using.
Yes, actually in Microsoft Teams, it's not bad. Again, I think the best thing to do is consider whether or not you're sharing any sort of personal or sensitive information. As you said, certainly in a presentation like this, there's no personal information being used, so it's perfectly fine to use any kind of tool, really. But I do think if you have participants and everybody's showing their images and sharing their images as part of the presentation or as part of the communication exchange, that you may want to consider, should we really be using this tool or not? I was actually attending a teleconference recently, and the presenter, who actually works for the Federal Privacy Commissioner's Office, somebody said to him, well, what tool do you use? And he actually said, we don't. He said, we only use teleconference, we never use video conferencing. And I thought that was an interesting statement for them to make. And I know the Privacy Commissioner's offices do not in any way endorse any products. They stay away from that. Right. They basically tell people that you're responsible for doing your research and figuring out which tools are going to be best utilized for the purpose that you have, and to ensure that if you are using it for the purpose of exchanging personal and sensitive information, that you are using a tool that does have encryption and or end-to-end encryption, and that you're being very careful in regards to recordings. And I should mention something else about recordings while I think about it, and that is that you do need consent from participants if you are recording. I know, Kerrilee, at the beginning you said the session is going to be recorded, so people are aware of that. It's important that people know so that they can decide whether or not they want to still continue to participate. So I think we should probably carry on then.
Perfect, great.
Slide, thanks. So just in regards to some compliance information, so private sector businesses in BC do have to comply with the Personal Information Protection Act, or called PIPA for short. This was actually enacted in 2004, so it's been around for quite a while now. And just to give you a little bit of history with that, the Federal Personal Information Protection and Electronics Document Act, or PIPEDA, as we call it for short, it was actually enacted in 2000. So our British Columbia law was enacted 4 years later. And part of the provincial requirement is that we have to stay and remain substantially similar to the federal law in order for our provincial law to take precedence within our province. So I say this because we're sort of constantly playing this sort of catch up between what the federal laws are doing in terms of updating, and then what we're doing at our end to update. So for example, when we first enacted our law in 2004, we had incorporated some things that weren't included in the federal Privacy Act. But then since then, the federal Privacy Act has included a few updates that we still don't have in our provincial law yet. So I know it can make it a little bit confusing, but I try to tell people that the first thing to do, especially if you're a business based in BC, is to make sure that you adhere to PIPA first. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, you may need to consider PIPA, so some things have been updated in that area. And the thing that's actually sort of rocking the privacy world right now in terms of changes that are happening globally is that 2 years ago, the European nations basically got together and decided that they needed one regulation law that all of them could adhere to, so that as they were exchanging information from country to country, everybody would be following the same set of rules. So that particular legislation, the General Data Protection Regulation Act, has, basically because of its very high standards, is setting a new standard for all the other countries around the world to try to adhere to. So that's one of the big sort of things that's being talked about in Canadian privacy law right now is, well, we should be changing it to actually integrate some of these higher standards. And you may be interested to know that in the United States, they don't have federal privacy law. So what happens is the landscape down there is particularly challenging because each state has their own privacy law. So it gets very confusing if you're down there to try to manage sort of what state requirements are for 52 states if you're actually running your business out of one state. So the new California Consumer Protection Act that's just been released as of January of this year is already making quite a few waves and pushing for federal privacy law reform in the US. Okay, so I know that might have been a little bit confusing, but it's easiest just to try to think about staying on track with PIPA. So in terms of, next slide, I thought it would be helpful if I actually provided a definition for personal information, because of course our Privacy Act is based on the protection of personal information. So what exactly does that mean? So the definition that we use for personal information is any information that can be used to identify someone either by itself or in combination with other information. And the reason why this definition is kind of broad is because sometimes we think, oh, my name and phone number, that's not really, a large amount of personal information, but really it's taking different components and thinking about the combinations of that information and how much then could actually be used against you in terms of if it was actually collected by someone who was very interested in identity fraud, and what the minimums are for what they need in order to be able to do that. So again, it's important to think about, it may not just be one single piece of information, but it's the combination of several of those together that can lead to quite big risk in regards to your identity and your information. So you'll see on the left-hand side that some of it initially, name, address, email address, may not seem too much information, but as soon as you start getting into, birth dates and medical information, even the names of your family members and your relationships, all of that can be collected and used potentially to create your identity and to take advantage of that. I always tell people that unfortunately, we don't have a sensitive personal information definition within our current privacy law, but we're starting to see that change. So for example, in the European Union's GDPR Act, they have a sensitive information definition that includes things like social insurance number, driver's license number, things like that, which could be used to create, copies of identification and again, then be taken into, for example, a bank and set up a bank account and things like that. So, it's important that all that kind of information is safeguarded no matter how and when you're collecting it as a business. Okay, so next slide. I thought it would be important to cover a little bit on regulation. So what happens in terms of, we have privacy law, but what's the regulation around that? So first and foremost, we have an Information and Privacy Commissioner. Our current commissioner's name is Michael McAvoy, and his office provides independent oversight in regards to our access and privacy laws. So of course, I've mentioned PIPA earlier. That's the Personal Information Protection Act that businesses and the private sector needs to adhere to. But there is also the counterpart on the public sector side called FIPA, or the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So although those two laws are similar, on the public sector side, there's more requirements and mandates than we actually have on the private sector side. Currently, they've been working in kind of two different arenas, but I think over time we're going to see that the private sector requirements will start to become more aligned with the requirements on the public sector side. So in terms of the Privacy Commissioner's jurisdiction, that can include companies with a location in BC but headquartered elsewhere. So I know sometimes people have said to me, well, I actually run a franchise operation and the head office is in Ontario. So which privacy laws am I supposed to adhere to? And the answer is, if you're located in BC, it's BC. But the counterpart is the head office in Ontario would be adhering to actually the federal law, because there isn't a provincial private sector law in Ontario. So they're adhering to the PIPA law while you're adhering to the BC PIPA law. But because those laws are actually pretty similar and aligned, you're really operating under the same sort of guidelines. It's important to note that there are some federal entities that aren't covered under provincial law because they're federal. So banks, airlines, for example, that's what happens with those particular organizations. Another interesting thing is, actually in our law, there are fines for offenses at the provincial level, up to $10,000 for individuals and up to $100,000 for organizations. I think what most private companies find interesting is that so far, the Privacy Office hasn't really pushed fines. They've been, felt that they really should just be issuing orders and doing audits and reviews. They've been avoiding really sort of instituting the fines because they've really felt that they should really be more on the guidance side as opposed to the fine side. But again, I want to caution people that is changing with the higher standards and the global sort of improvements in privacy law. Fines are becoming a big thing. So I think when our laws do get updated within the next couple of years, that you'll see fines becoming more used as a way to make sure that organizations are complying. So I say to a lot of my clients right now, it's a good time now to get that privacy management program underway if you don't have one, because you want to make sure it's in place before fines become a big thing. Okay, so on to the next slide. I think it's important for people to understand what are non-compliance business risks and costs. And I do a lot of presentations, and I know a lot of businesses don't have a privacy management program in place or aren't even sure what they need to do to comply. And I think it's important to understand that you run risks if you don't have privacy as a consideration in the way you run your business. So those four main risks, as you can see here, are staff breaches, and that's really due to a lack of having privacy policy, practices, and training. You could be making some poor decisions because you're not thinking about risks that could include privacy. I know that a lot of organizations will think about risk in different ways, but quite often they don't include that privacy factor. And then there is a complacency and reliance on third parties to protect personal information. So if you are using even third-party applications, you know, you might be using a reservation system, I'm just trying to think, or you know, even sort of a mailing system for your customers. If that information is being stored within that third-party software, you may not be aware or may not really be looking into how they're actually protecting that information, and you're still responsible for that. So that's something to keep in mind. And the fourth thing, which is really coming to the forefront now, is that customers and individuals are now becoming more aware of and concerned about their personal information and want to make sure that the companies that they're dealing with are protecting it. So we're seeing now an increase in complaints that are being received by the Privacy Commissioner's Office. So, so now what you're seeing happening is a lot of customers are starting to question companies and their protection factors, and then they're actually starting to do more reports and complaints. So again, as a business, you want to avoid that. So in terms of, you know, hard costs, certainly the commissioner has, if they're doing an investigation or an audit, they always come out with orders and recommendations. And those orders and recommendations can be very, very costly. So for example, if they feel your computer system isn't, you know, secure, you don't have the proper protocols in place, or you're not storing it properly, or you don't have encryption in your storage, they can actually order that. So, and you would have a specific amount of time to comply to whatever their orders and recommendations are. In terms of credit monitoring, I know you've, I'm sure, seen this as, you know, breaches have been announced and companies have sort of try to appease their customers by offering them credit monitoring. I know that credit monitoring costs on average about $200 a person. So if you consider the fact that if you have a business that has 1,000 customers and if a breach happens, if you're going to look at credit monitoring, providing credit monitoring to those customers for a period of time, and the most common period of time seems to be 3 to 5 years now. If you take that 1,000 times it by 200 and times that by, you know, 3 to 5 years, that's a huge, substantial cost that you could be incurring just to try to keep your business going and try to keep those customers still on board with you. So this is one of the reasons why you want to look at if you're, you know, you might want to make sure that your retainment practices are kept in line so that, for example, you don't have a customer, you know, so 3 years later, that customer is no longer with you. You might want to delete them from your system so that they're not a liability later on. Of course, reputation management and revenue loss sort of go hand in hand with data breaches. You know, a lot of small businesses, unfortunately, wouldn't be able to survive a major data breach just because their business doesn't allow that. They're running on such thin margins already that it just would be really hard to keep that business going. Of course, diminished customer trust is all tied into that as well. And fines, although they do exist, as I said, they haven't really been given out yet. But as you can see, what I just talked about would probably be the bulk of the cost of dealing with a breach. Okay, so next slide. Hopefully I didn't scare anybody too much with that slide, but it's sometimes hard to look at hard reality, and unfortunately that is becoming more of a reality for a lot of organizations. I think I saw a recent stat that said data breaches were up 25% since the pandemic started. So in terms of, you know, all this remote working from home has really got the hackers all excited because they've realized there's so many different ways to actually infiltrate and compromise systems through this time period. So it's unfortunate they've really seen it as an opportunity to benefit themselves at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah. If I could just jump in again, sorry for 1 second. I just have a story to add to your previous slide. you mentioned that you are responsible for the applications that you use. And I was working with a client looking at integrating a Shopify store into QuickBooks, right? So how to make, like, let's use an app to drag that information over because, you know, saves time, energy, right? The accounting's there, you can just match transactions. And when I dug into the privacy policy of the application, it was scary what I was reading in there, because they're taking all this customer information from Shopify, you're giving it to the app to then give it to QuickBooks. And in the fine print, it says, oh, we also run these other 4 companies, and this information may be shared with these 4 companies, right? So there's a lot of that when you're looking at, you know, apps, even in Slack, right? Adding the Giphy app or things like that. Like it just opens up this whole new world of possibility for those privacy breaches as well. So it's really, you know, I want to reiterate the importance of looking at what are the applications you're using and what are their privacy policies, and how do you, if you are using it, how do you have to update your own company's privacy policy to name and make people aware that you are using these applications and here's where their privacy policy is. I think, you know, can you speak to that piece about that transparency? And all of us on our website also have, like, here's our privacy policy, and how often you should be looking and updating that as well. If it's the time, if you're going into that, we can pause, but it was just one of the thoughts I had from a recent experience that I had as well.
Yes, I will cover that briefly in a future slide in regards to service providers, but in general, yes, you are responsible for every tool you use and the privacy policies related to that. And as you mentioned, it's really critical that you read those privacy policies of those companies and make sure that, you know, you are choosing the best tool you can to protect that private information. I mentioned earlier about, you know, trying to, I think with recordings of video conferencing, to make sure that that remains in Canada. And it's tough because a lot of these applications are developed in the US and are stored in the US. Unfortunately, right now, we're still in a situation where the majority of that is still held in the US, although what's happened with the GDPR in Europe is that they have a requirement for the servers to be located in their countries. So I'm hoping, I mean, we're seeing a little bit of migration now with some of the US companies locating servers in Canada. Microsoft is one, for example, where they're actually now running servers that are, you know, based out of Toronto and Montreal to store Canadian data. But, you know, these are questions that you should ask your, you know, if you are dealing with a software rep, you know, you can always say to them, well, I just want to know, where is the information being stored? And they are required to tell you. You know, again, if you are making decisions about using particular tools, it's important to look at some of the privacy considerations to make a decision on which tool would be better to use. You know, right now we don't have a restriction. I mean, unless you're a healthcare company and you're collecting very sensitive medical information about people, there is no requirement to keep that information stored in Canada. But if you're thinking about it from, you know, your own individual perspective, you would want your information to remain in Canada as much as you can control, because in the US, they have very different jurisdictional law that basically allows any of their, you know, like the FBI or police investigations, they could, you know, your name could just be flagged. You could have the same name as somebody else in the US who's under suspicion for a bunch of different things. And they can go to all these companies and ask for any information they have on you, and you would never know it. At least in Canada, we do have, you know, they do have to provide some notification if they're accessing your information. It's, you know, it's not necessarily kept hush-hush like it is in the US. So, you know, I mean, the other thing that could happen over time too is that the US could be, you know, making their privacy law more stringent, and maybe that will will be more protected in the future, but right now it's not. So again, you know, we have to think as Canadians that we have to do our best in order to maintain the private information of Canadians where we can.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so, oh, I wanted to just cover some basics, because a lot of businesses I find when I do these presentations don't, you know, they say, well, what do I need to do as a sort of minimum to get started to make sure I'm complying? So this is sort of my very sort of capture it all in one slide explanation. So the first thing you really need to do is make sure that you're accepting organizational accountability. So you're accepting the legal responsibility to keep that personal information that you collect, use, and disclose, and that you're going to do your best to make sure that everything within your organization is in place to protect it. The second thing is you actually must designate a privacy officer. Now that privacy officer could be anyone within your organization, but you must have somebody who, if somebody has a privacy concern, they know who to contact within your organization, and that everybody else within the organization knows who that person is, so that they can manage and handle any kind of request or question. So in terms of this person who's your privacy officer should have the ability to report to senior management directly if a privacy issue comes up that they can't manage. So in most cases, most of the companies I've worked with, their privacy officer is either somebody who's in, who actually might be their chief, not necessarily their CEO, but it could be somebody fairly high up, like a human resource person or an assistant to the president, or it can be, as I said, it can be anybody, but you just have to make sure you have one. Now, in terms of, there are responsibilities for the role, so it's just not a factor of saying to somebody, hey, you're going to now be our privacy officer. That person needs to understand that that part of that role requires that they need to ensure that the organization is in compliance with the Personal Information Protection Act. And that involves ensuring that your organization has a privacy management program, which basically includes program controls and oversight and review plan. And I'll delve into that, I think, a little bit. I think I delve into that a little bit further. But the other thing that's really important to realize is under the law, there's this 30-day time limit for responding to access and correction requests and responding to questions, concerns, and complaints. So this means that if you don't respond within this 30-day time limit, the person who's making that access or correction request or asking that question can actually go to the privacy commissioner's office then and complain that you haven't responded to their requests. And what that can do is open up an investigation or an audit or review of your organization. So I always say to people, you need to make sure that you understand that you have this time limit. And the last thing you want to do is red flag yourself for the privacy commission to come take a look and see if you actually have all these things in place. So it's important, you know, to cover these few things. Make sure that you have a privacy officer who's designated, and that person's information or contact information should be included in your privacy policy that you actually publicize on your website. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that person's name, but there has to be either a phone number that can be internally linked to your privacy officer, or there should be for sure an email address that will go to that privacy officer. So if I have a question or a complaint, I can go to your website and figure out who that person is and make sure that I'm getting to that person in a straight line for them to respond within that 30-day time period. Okay, I think next slide. So I'm just wrapping up with a few privacy tips then. I mentioned earlier that it's important to always update your software whenever updates are available. So I recommend you do that right away. You need to be aware that there are hackers out there now impersonating Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, and even the World Health Organization now for phishing scams. So again, with this change in COVID and everything that's happening, hackers are now sort of realizing how can they, infiltrate and get into places quickly. And now I know that with, of course, the province reopening up and some businesses being concerned about whether they need to test, customers or take temperature checks of their employees, or whether they need to do health screenings. Some of this can be quite invasive, and it's important to understand, how to do it without putting yourself in a difficult situation. So there's this great infographic that the International Association of Privacy Professionals has just recently released on testing health monitoring. So I recommend that if you're considering any of these testing things in your business, that you take a look at that infographic. It just helps you think about whether you need certain things or not, or how to manage them if you are actually collecting that information. And then I recently found an article that was released by the Law Society of BC on video conferencing. And it actually had, of course, from the legal perspective on their side, it had some really useful information on things that you should consider when using video conferencing tools. So if you are using it to exchange personal and sensitive information, they had some recommendations on, how you should make sure that that was being set up, not only at your end, but at your client's end. So sometimes I think we forget, okay, well, I'm just going to make this call and it's you've got all your privacy sort of controls in place, but it could be that somebody else at the other end has not thought about those same considerations, and you should make sure that they're aware of that. Now, I think I mentioned earlier that I was going to actually go into a little bit more on the service provider side, and I just realized that this slide deck doesn't have that. So I thought maybe I should sort of just cover that a little bit more. In terms of when I mentioned that the privacy officer, really does need to be involved in developing and implementing a privacy management program within the organization, their responsibilities include a service provider review. And so when I'm working with my clients, when we look at a service provider review, we're looking at everything. We're looking at third-party applications. We're looking at we're also even looking at their cleaning contract. So whoever comes and cleans their office, we're looking at their contract. We're looking at, even their garbage pickup and disposal supporter. So we look at basically everything that they're doing in regards to their privacy protection controls within their organization. So for example, even with the contractor who does cleaning, are the people, oh, I'm sorry, I hear oops, sorry. Gardening
Life happens.
Yeah. So, we're looking at, are those cleaning staff bonded even, or, are they, have they taken any privacy training? Do they know that they're not supposed to be looking at, documents that you've left out, even though you shouldn't have been leaving them out? Are they, are they ensuring that as they're picking up the garbage, is it, if there's paper, is it being shredded? So there's different ways of looking at it. Even those waste collection companies that pick up, shredded paper, like what happens to that paper? Like, how is it disposed? So there are things that you want to just double check and make sure that they are, following proper protocols and are doing the right things. So that service provider piece isn't just regulated to applications and data. There are other physical protections and safeguards that you need to look at. And that brings me to the other point of, when you're considering even safeguards, you need to consider physical safeguards, administrative safeguards, and that includes things like policy and training, and those technical safeguards too. So it's, you know, sometimes it can take a little bit of work to get that privacy management program together, but once you have it together and it's all in one place and you've got these practices and assessments that you've incorporated into that, it should be really easy to maintain and move forward with, you know, just some, you know, annual training updates for your staff and just some protocols that you can adjust quite easily without too much work. So I always tell people the best time to start is now.
That's right.
Before you actually, you know, collect more, or it may actually even stop you from collecting personal information you don't need, so that you don't have to worry about that down the road. So,
Right.
yeah.
Very good. I know, and it might seem overwhelming and a bit daunting, but as you said, if you start now and then, you know, extrapolate on some of those additional pieces as well, right? But what are, you know, that personal information that you're collecting right now, what are you doing with that piece for sure? Good. So thank you very much, Marilyn. It's hard to believe that we are almost out of time, or actually a little bit over time, but just, yeah, a wealth of information and tips. Thank you so much. And I do recommend for those of you joining us today to sign up for Marilyn's weekly updates. They're very informative, and I know I appreciate getting them as well. So thank you for that, Marilyn, as well. Just quickly, I know we're over time a couple of minutes here. Here's our upcoming webinars. Again, you can go on wec.ca to learn more about those that are coming up. And then again, let us know, right? Suggesting that topic. If there's an area that you're finding that you always have lots of questions and are in need of support, you can suggest those topics to us as well. So again, thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Danielle, for being here with us in the background as well, providing that support. And thank you to everyone joining us here today. Lots of information, lots of pieces, but we will share a follow-up email as well with some of those links and resources for you, and our quick survey that we hope that you will also provide your feedback as well. So thanks very much. Again, everyone, enjoy your day and watch for the follow-up email. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.